The unseen mentor. In the small town of Elmwood, the local high school was known for its traditional values and old-fashioned charm. Among its staff was Mrs. Evelyn Carter, a history teacher who had been with the school for over 30 years. Known for her stern demeanor and impeccable knowledge of history, Mrs. Carter was both respected and feared by her students. She had an unusual habit. She would often stay late after school, working in her classroom long after the last bell had rung. Students and staff would occasionally hear the sound of chalk scratching on the blackboard, even when no one was supposed to be there. Some said Mrs. Carter was simply dedicated to her work. Others whispered that she was a little too invested in her lessons. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of exams, a student named Mark decided to stay late to finish a project. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the school was enveloped in darkness, Mark's footsteps echoed through the empty halls. He made his way to the library, where he planned to work, but as he passed Mrs. Carter's classroom, he noticed a flickering light coming from under the door. Curious and a bit nervous, Mark peeked through the small window in the door. Inside, the room appeared to be empty, but the light from the desk lamp cast eerie shadows against the walls. The blackboard was covered in chalk scribbles, but there was no sign of Mrs. Carter. Mark knocked softly on the door, but there was no response. He opened it slightly, and a chill ran down his spine. The classroom was cold, the temperature dropping significantly. As he stepped inside, he noticed that the chalk on the blackboard seemed to be moving on its own, writing and rewriting historical dates and names in a frenzied manner. His heart raced as he turned to leave, but he was startled by the sound of footsteps behind him. He spun around to find Mrs. Carter standing at the door, her face expressionless. Her eyes were hollow and dark, as if they had seen too much. "Mark," she said in a voice that seemed to echo unnaturally, "you shouldn't be here so late." Mark tried to explain himself, but Mrs. Carter's gaze was unyielding. "The school is not a place for the unprepared," she said cryptically. "The lessons must be learned." Suddenly, the room seemed to grow colder and the lights flickered. Mark's anxiety grew as Mrs. Carter stepped closer, her shadow lengthening and twisting in the dim light. He could see faint, ghostly images moving in the corners of the room, figures from history, trapped in their eternal lesson. I'm sorry," Mark stammered, backing away. "I didn't mean to intrude." Mrs. Carter's gaze softened momentarily, but then her eyes narrowed again. "Be careful where you tread. Some lessons are meant to be learned from a distance." With that, she turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing down the hall. Mark watched as the door to the classroom slowly closed, the chalkboard now blank. He hurried out of the school, his heart pounding. Over the next few days, he heard rumors about Mrs. Carter's strange behavior. Some claimed she had been involved in secretive, esoteric studies, while others said she had a tragic past connected to the school. One night, a few weeks later, Mark returned to the school with a group of friends, determined to uncover the truth. They explored the empty hallways and classrooms, but found nothing unusual, except for the faint sound of chalk scratching on a blackboard and the occasional cold spot that seemed to follow them. They eventually reached Mrs. Carter's classroom and found it locked, the lights off. Mark's friends were too scared to continue, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking inside. The next morning, Mrs. Carter was absent from school. Rumors quickly spread that she had retired suddenly, leaving no notice and no explanation. Her classroom remained locked, and no one seemed to know where she had gone. Mark and his friends continued to hear the occasional story about the strange happenings at the school, especially during late hours. The memory of Mrs. Carter's haunting presence stayed with them, a reminder of the unseen mentor who had left an indelible mark on their lives. To this day, students who stay late in Elmwood High sometimes hear the scratch of chalk on the blackboard, a chilling reminder that some lessons, and some teachers, are best left undisturbed. Story 2. The Phantom Principal. At Ravenwood High, Principal Richard Harlow was a figure of authority and discipline. Known for his stern demeanor and unwavering rules, he was both respected and feared by students and staff alike. His office, located in a secluded corner of the school, was filled with old photographs, dusty files, and a large oak desk that had seen better days. One stormy night, after a particularly rough day of disciplinary meetings, Principal Harlow decided to stay late to catch up on paperwork. As the rain pounded against the windows and lightning illuminated the darkened hallways, the school felt eerily quiet. While working late into the night, Principal Harlow heard faint, disembodied whispers echoing through the empty corridors. He dismissed them as tricks of his tired mind, but as the clock ticked past midnight, the whispers grew louder and more insistent. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the office door creaked open. Principal Harlow turned to see a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, barely visible in the dim light. The figure wore an old-fashioned principal's suit and had a face obscured by darkness. "Who's there?" Harlow called out, his voice echoing through the room. The figure did not answer but slowly approached, its footsteps barely audible over the sound of the storm. As it came closer, Harlow noticed that the air around the figure was colder and a chill ran down his spine. The figure finally spoke, its voice a deep, resonant growl. "You have failed to uphold the standards, Principal Harlow." The lights went out completely, plunging the office into darkness. Harlow could feel the cold presence standing right beside him. He reached for his flashlight, but before he could turn it on, the figure vanished. The next morning, the staff found Principal Harlow's office in disarray. Papers were scattered everywhere, and the desk was covered in an inexplicable layer of frost. Harlow was never seen again, and rumors spread that he had been taken by the ghost of a long-forgotten principal who once ruled the school with an iron fist. To this day, staff and students report hearing whispers and feeling a cold draft in that corner of the school, a chilling reminder of the phantom principal who lingers in the shadows. Esther Oroway-Free, the vanishing teacher. Miss Clara Jennings was a beloved English teacher at Brookside High, known for her engaging lessons and caring demeanor. She had a particular fondness for classic literature and often stayed late in her classroom, grading papers and preparing her next lesson. One evening, as the sun set and the last students left for the day, Miss Jennings stayed behind to finish up some grading. As the clock ticked past 7 p.m., she noticed a strange, unsettling silence in the school. The usual sounds of the building, footsteps in the hallways, the hum of the ventilation system, seemed to have faded away. Miss Jennings was lost in her grading when she heard a soft knock on the door. She opened it to find no one there, but a chill swept through the room. Shrugging it off, she returned to her work. Minutes later, she heard the knock again, more insistent this time. She went to the door but found nothing once more. As she turned back to her desk, she noticed that her classroom seemed darker than usual. The lights flickered, and the shadows on the walls grew long and ominous. The knocking sound continued, growing louder and more frantic. Miss Jennings tried to ignore it, but the unease was overwhelming. Suddenly, the classroom door slammed shut, and the room was filled with an eerie silence. Miss Jennings tried to open the door, but it was stuck fast. As she struggled, she noticed something odd. Her desk lamp was glowing with an unnatural light, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The shadows seemed to writhe and twist, taking on grotesque shapes. The door finally swung open, and Miss Jennings stumbled out into the hallway, her face pale and her hands trembling. She never returned to the classroom, and the next day, her colleagues found the room empty, with papers scattered on the floor and the lamp still glowing ominously. Rumors spread that Miss Jennings had vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only the unsettling presence of her classroom. Students and staff who ventured into the room reported hearing whispers and feeling a cold, oppressive atmosphere, as if the room itself were haunted by the teacher who had once filled it with life. Story 4. The Cursed Classroom. Mr. Thomas Reynolds was a science teacher known for his eccentric methods and passion for the subject. His classroom was filled with old equipment, strange specimens, and numerous shelves of dusty books. He often regaled his students with tales of scientific breakthroughs and mysterious phenomena. One evening, as Mr. Reynolds was preparing for an upcoming science fair, he noticed something strange. A small, dusty book had appeared on his desk. He didn't recall seeing it before, and its cover was adorned with arcane symbols and faded text. Curious, he opened the book and began to read. The text was a mixture of ancient science and dark rituals, and as he read, he felt a strange sense of foreboding. The room seemed to grow colder, and the air became thick with an unnatural stillness. As the night wore on, Mr. Reynolds began to notice odd occurrences. Shadows moving of their own accord, strange noises coming from the dark corners of the room, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. The book's contents seemed to come alive, and he could see ghostly images flitting across the pages. At one point, he looked up and saw a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room. It was a man dressed in old-fashioned scientific attire, his face obscured by darkness. The figure moved closer, and Mr. Reynolds felt an icy hand touch his shoulder. Terrified, he slammed the book shut and tried to leave the room, but the door wouldn't budge. The shadows grew more aggressive, swirling around him and whispering incomprehensible words. Finally, with a burst of adrenaline, Mr. Reynolds managed to force the door open and fled from the room. The next day, the school found Mr. Reynolds' classroom in disarray, with the cursed book lying open on the desk. He was never seen again, and the room was sealed off. To this day, students and staff who enter the area report strange occurrences, flickering lights, disembodied voices, and a chilling presence that seems to emanate from the cursed book and its dark secrets. Story 5. The Mysterious Substitute. At Crestwood High, Mr. Jonathan Hale was a well-liked math teacher known for his engaging lessons and friendly demeanor. However, one week he fell ill, and the school had to find a substitute on short notice. They'd brought in a new teacher, Mr. Victor Graves, who appeared unremarkable at first glance, but had an unsettling aura. Mr. Graves took over Mr. Hale's classes, and students quickly noticed that his teaching style was odd. His lessons were filled with obscure references and unsettling, cryptic problems that seemed to have no logical solutions. The classroom atmosphere grew tense, and students felt a pervasive sense of unease. One student, Emily, stayed late one day to work on her homework in the classroom. As she sat at her desk, she noticed that Mr. Graves was still in the room, though he was supposed to have left. He stood at the board, scribbling out bizarre equations and symbols. Emily tried to ignore him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her. As the hours passed, the room grew colder, and Emily noticed shadows moving around the edges of her vision. The equations on the board seemed to change, forming disturbing patterns that made her feel increasingly uneasy. She tried to leave, but the door wouldn't open. Mr. Graves turned to Emily with a strange, unsettling smile. "You must solve the equation to leave," he said in a voice that seemed to echo unnaturally. The shadows on the walls grew darker, and the temperature dropped even further. Desperate, Emily tried to solve the equations, but they made no sense. The room became a whirlwind of cold and darkness, and she could hear distant, disembodied whispers. Finally, with a burst of panic-fueled energy, she managed to force the door open and fled into the hallway. The next day, Mr. Graves was gone, and no one seemed to remember him ever being there. The classroom was found in disarray, with strange equations scrawled on the board and an eerie chill lingering in the air. The incident became the stuff of legend among the students, and many avoided that classroom after hours, fearful of what they might encounter. Story 6. The Eerie Art Teacher. Miss Linda Martinez was an art teacher at Willowbrook School, known for her talent and creativity. Her classroom was a vibrant place, filled with student artworks, colorful paints, and artistic clutter. However, there was something unsettling about her, an aura that made some students feel uncomfortable. One day, a new student named Jake joined Miss Martinez's class. He was a talented artist with a keen eye for detail. As he worked on a project late into the evening, he noticed something peculiar. Miss Martinez's paintings seemed to change when she wasn't looking. The once beautiful landscapes and portraits began to take on disturbing, grotesque features. Jake decided to stay after school to investigate. As he worked, he saw Miss Martinez walking through the hallways, her eyes fixed on him with a cold, unblinking stare. Her presence felt oppressive, and the paintings on the walls seemed to come alive, their eyes following him as he moved. He turned his attention to one particular painting, a portrait of a woman with an unsettling expression. As he watched, the woman's eyes seemed to shift, following his every move. The background of the painting darkened, and the woman's expression grew more menacing. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and Jake felt a cold draft. The painting seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and Jake could hear faint whispers coming from it. Terrified, he tried to leave, but the door to the art room was locked. Miss Martinez appeared in the doorway, her face expressionless. "Art reveals the truth," she said in a voice that seemed to echo. "Sometimes the truth is not what you expect." The lights went out completely, and Jake was plunged into darkness. When he finally managed to get the door open and escape, he never returned to the art room. The next day, the painting had changed back to its original form, and Miss Martinez's eerie behavior was dismissed as a figment of his imagination. Story 7. The Haunting Librarian. Mr. Alan Brooks was the librarian at Hillside School, a quiet man who preferred the company of books over people. He was known for his extensive knowledge of literature and his meticulous organization of the library. However, there were always rumors about the library being haunted, especially after dark. One evening, a student named Sarah stayed late to work on a research project. As she sifted through old, dusty books in the back corner of the library, she noticed that Mr. Brooks seemed to be unusually quiet. He moved silently through the rows of books, his footsteps barely audible. Sarah glanced up from her work and saw Mr. Brooks standing at the end of the aisle, staring intently at her. His eyes seemed hollow and distant, and he made no move to acknowledge her presence. The air in the library grew colder, and Sarah felt a growing sense of dread. She continued to work, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling. As she looked up again, Mr. Brooks was no longer in sight. The library was eerily silent, and the temperature had dropped significantly. Shadows seemed to dance along the rows of books, and the once familiar space felt alien and foreboding. Suddenly, Sarah heard a rustling noise coming from the old bookshelves. She turned to see books being pulled from the shelves by an unseen force, their pages flipping rapidly as if in a frenzy. The library lights flickered, and Sarah could see ghostly figures appearing and disappearing among the books. Panicked, Sarah tried to find Mr. Brooks, but found only an empty library. She hurried out, the cold draft following her as she left. The next day, Mr. Brooks was absent, and the library was eerily normal, with no sign of the previous night's disturbances. Students and staff who ventured into the library after hours reported strange occurrences, whispering voices, flickering lights, and a chilling presence that seemed to linger among the books. Mr. Brooks never returned, and the library became known as a place where the past refused to stay buried. Story 8. The Vanishing Classroom. At Elmwood Academy, Ms. Julia Hargrove was known for her innovative teaching methods and passion for science. Her classroom was filled with complex diagrams, scientific equipment, and a large, old-fashioned globe. Students admired her dedication, but found her classroom's atmosphere oddly unsettling. One evening, as the school was emptying out, a student named Alex stayed behind to finish a project. He had always been curious about Ms. Hargrove's extensive collection of old books and scientific instruments, so he decided to explore the classroom while he worked. As he worked late into the night, he noticed something strange. The classroom seemed to be getting darker, despite the lights being on. The shadows on the walls grew longer and more distorted, and Alex felt a creeping sense of unease. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness, and Alex heard a soft, eerie whispering coming from the corner of the room. The whispering grew louder and more urgent, as if trying to communicate something important. When the lights flickered back on, Alex was horrified to find that the classroom had changed. The walls were now lined with strange, arcane symbols, and the scientific equipment was covered in a thick layer of dust, as if it hadn't been used in decades. The globe was spinning slowly on its own, and a cold draft filled the room. Alex tried to leave, but the door was stuck. The whispering grew more frantic, and he could see ghostly figures moving among the desks and chairs. Panicked, he managed to force the door open and fled from the classroom. The next day, Alex told his friends about the strange experience, but when they went to investigate, the classroom was back to normal. Ms. Hargrove seemed puzzled when asked about the incident and assured them that the classroom had always been as it should be. The strange symbols and ghostly figures were never seen again, but the classroom remained a source of unease for those who knew its mysterious history. Story 9. The Unfinished Lesson. Mr. Robert Langley was a history teacher at Crestview High, known for his engaging storytelling and deep knowledge of historical events. His classroom was adorned with historical artifacts and old maps. However, there was a sense of melancholy about the room, as if it held secrets from the past. One night, a student named Clara stayed late to study for an upcoming history exam. As she reviewed her notes, she noticed that Mr. Langley was still in the classroom, even though he was supposed to have left hours earlier. He was hunched over his desk, scribbling furiously in a notebook. Clara watched from the back of the room, trying to make out what he was writing. The room was quiet, and the air was heavy with the scent of old books and musty papers. Mr. Langley's writing seemed to be a frantic, almost incoherent scrawl, and Clara could see that he was becoming increasingly agitated. The lights flickered, and a cold wind swept through the room, making the papers on the desk flutter. Clara could hear faint whispers, as if someone was speaking just out of earshot. She felt a chill run down her spine and decided to leave, but as she approached the door, it slammed shut on its own. Mr. Langley looked up, his face pale and drawn. "You must finish it," he said in a voice that seemed to echo unnaturally. "The lesson must be completed." Clara was terrified and tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The room seemed to close in around her, and the whispers grew louder. Finally, with a surge of panic, Clara managed to break the door open and fled from the classroom. The next day, Mr. Langley was absent, and the classroom was found in disarray, with papers scattered everywhere and the notebook lying open with incomplete notes. Clara never returned to that classroom, and Mr. Langley's whereabouts remained a mystery. The room was rumored to be haunted by the unfinished lesson and the ghostly presence of the teacher who had become trapped in his own past. Story 10. The Cursed Chemistry Lab. Ms. Eleanor Briggs was the chemistry teacher at Greystone School, known for her meticulous experiments and her obsession with perfection. Her chemistry lab was a pristine, organized space filled with beakers, test tubes, and complex equipment. However, there were whispers among students about the lab's strange occurrences. One evening, a student named Jake decided to stay late to finish a chemistry project. As he worked, he noticed that the temperature in the lab seemed to drop significantly. The air grew cold and heavy, and Jake could see his breath in the dim light. He turned his attention to a set of old, dusty chemistry books on a high shelf. Curious, he reached for one and accidentally knocked over a bottle of unknown liquid. As the liquid spilled onto the floor, a strange, pungent smell filled the room. The lights flickered, and Jake saw ghostly figures moving among the equipment. The figures appeared to be scientists from a bygone era, their faces twisted in agony. The equipment began to move on its own, and the beakers and test tubes rattled ominously. In a panic, Jake tried to leave, but the door to the lab was locked tight. He heard a low, mournful wail coming from the shadows, and the temperature dropped even further. The ghostly scientists seemed to be reaching out at him, their faces contorted in sorrow. Jake finally managed to force the door open and escaped from the lab, his heart racing. The next day, the chemistry lab was found in perfect order, with no sign of the night's disturbances. The mysterious liquid was gone, and the ghostly figures were nowhere to be seen. Students who heard Jake's story avoided the chemistry lab after hours, believing it to be cursed by the spirits of scientists who had once been trapped by their own experiments. The lab remained a place of dread, its dark past lingering in the cold, eerie atmosphere. Story 11. The Whispering Gym Coach. At Fairview High, Coach Dan Mitchell was known for his strict discipline and dedication to sports. The gymnasium was his domain, and he was often seen working late, reviewing game footage and preparing training schedules. However, there were unsettling rumors about the gym's atmosphere after dark. One evening, a student named Lily stayed after school to practice for an upcoming sports event. As she practiced on the court, she noticed Coach Mitchell still in the gym, sitting alone in the bleachers and staring intently at her. The gym felt oddly quiet, and Lily could hear faint, whispering voices that seemed to come from nowhere. The whispers grew louder and more insistent, and Lily saw shadows moving along the walls. The temperature in the gym dropped, and the air became thick with an oppressive feeling. Coach Mitchell's eyes were fixed on her, but he made no move to help or speak. Lily tried to ignore the whispers and focus on her practice, but the voices became increasingly frantic. The shadows on the walls seemed to grow darker and more menacing, and the gym's lights flickered intermittently. She felt as if she were being watched by unseen eyes. Finally, Lily couldn't take it anymore and decided to leave. As she approached the exit, she felt a cold hand grip her shoulder. She turned to find Coach Mitchell's face twisted in a grotesque expression of fear and sadness. "The whispers won't stop," he said, his voice trembling. "They're trying to tell you something." Lily fled from the gym, and the next day, Coach Mitchell was absent. The gym was found in disarray, with equipment scattered and the lights still flickering. The whispers and shadows were never seen again, but students reported feeling an unsettling presence in the gym, as if the echoes of the whispers and the haunted eyes of the coach lingered in the air. As to Ori 12, the enigmatic math teacher. At Greenfield High, Mr. Harold Finch was known for his love of mathematics and his peculiar teaching methods. His classroom was filled with complex mathematical symbols, intricate diagrams, and old chalkboards that seemed to have a life of their own. Though he was well respected, some students found his teaching style unsettling. One evening, a student named Laura stayed after school to work on a math project. As she entered Mr. Finch's classroom, she noticed that he was still there, hunched over a large chalkboard covered in dense, inscrutable equations. The room felt colder than usual, and the flickering fluorescent lights cast eerie shadows on the walls. As Laura worked at her desk, she heard Mr. Finch muttering to himself, his voice low and rhythmic. She glanced over and saw him writing and erasing equations rapidly, his movements jerky and disjointed. The equations on the board seemed to change and shift, forming patterns that made no logical sense. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and Laura noticed that the chalkboards were covered in a fine layer of frost. The shadows on the walls began to twist and writhe, and the whispers of long-forgotten mathematical formulas filled the air. Suddenly, Mr. Finch's chalk snapped, and he let out a sharp, frustrated cry. He turned to Laura with wild eyes and said, "The solution is almost complete. The final equation must be solved." Laura tried to leave, but the door was locked tight. The room was filled with an unsettling hum, and the equations on the boards began to glow with an otherworldly light. Desperate, Laura grabbed a piece of chalk and tried to solve the equations, but they only grew more complex and inscrutable. After what felt like an eternity, the room returned to normal. The equations were gone, and Mr. Finch was no longer there. The classroom was cold and silent, with no sign of the bizarre events that had transpired. The next day, Mr. Finch was absent, and his classroom was found in disarray, with chalk scattered on the floor and equations written in an unfamiliar script. The students who heard Laura's story avoided the classroom, believing it to be haunted by the enigmatic teacher and his cryptic equations. Story 13. The Haunted Music Room. Ms. Patricia Blackwell was the music teacher at Lakewood School, known for her passion for classical music and her dedication to her students. Her music room was filled with old pianos, dusty sheet music, and antique musical instruments. Despite her kind demeanor, there was something eerie about the room that made some students uneasy. One night, a student named Kevin stayed late to practice his piano skills. As he played, he noticed that the room seemed to grow colder and quieter. The once familiar sound of the piano keys now seemed to be accompanied by a faint, ghostly melody that came from nowhere. Kevin glanced around and saw Ms. Blackwell sitting at an old grand piano in the corner of the room. She was playing a hauntingly beautiful tune, her fingers moving gracefully over the keys. However, there was something unsettling about her. Her eyes were vacant, and her movements seemed mechanical. As the melody grew louder, Kevin felt an oppressive presence in the room. The shadows on the walls began to dance, and the temperature dropped even further. The ghostly melody seemed to come from multiple sources, filling the room with an eerie harmony that made Kevin's skin crawl. Suddenly, the music stopped, and the room was filled with an unsettling silence. Miss Blackwell's figure began to flicker and fade, her form dissolving into the shadows. Kevin tried to leave, but the door was locked tight, and the windows were covered in an impenetrable darkness. In a moment of sheer panic, Kevin finally managed to break the door open and fled from the music room. The next day, Ms. Blackwell was absent, and the music room was found in disarray, with sheet music scattered on the floor and the piano keys covered in a thick layer of dust. The haunting melody was never heard again, but students who entered the music room reported feeling a chilling presence and hearing faint, ghostly music in the dead of night. The room remained a place of dread, its eerie past lingering in the cold, silent atmosphere. Story 16. The Phantom of the Gymnasium. At Northfield High, Coach Richard Barrett was known for his rigorous training and unwavering discipline. The gymnasium was his domain, a massive space filled with athletic equipment and trophies. Despite its utilitarian purpose, there was an unsettling air about the gym after dark. One evening, a student named Emily stayed late to practice her gymnastics routine. As she worked on the uneven bars, she noticed that Coach Barrett was still in the gym, sitting quietly in the bleachers with a stern expression. His presence was unusual because he was known to leave promptly after practice. The gym lights flickered erratically, and the temperature dropped significantly. Emily felt a cold breeze and saw her breath misting in the air. The trophies and equipment cast eerie shadows that seemed to move and shift as if alive. Emily glanced over at Coach Barrett and saw that his figure appeared translucent, almost as if he were a ghost. The shadows on the walls began to distort into menacing shapes, and she could hear faint, disembodied voices whispering in the corners of the gym. As she tried to leave, the gym doors slammed shut, and the whispering voices grew louder, forming a cacophony of disjointed phrases. Coach Barrett stood up and began to walk toward Emily, his movements slow and deliberate. "The routine is incomplete," he said in a voice that sounded both ancient and hollow. "You must finish it." Terrified, Emily tried to break open the doors, but they wouldn't budge. The room seemed to close in on her, and the shadows grew darker and more threatening. With a surge of fear, Emily finally managed to force the doors open and escaped into the hallway. The next day, Coach Barrett was absent, and the gym was found in disarray, with equipment scattered and the lights flickering ominously. The students who heard Emily's story avoided the gym after hours, believing it to be haunted by the phantom of the coach and the restless spirits of athletes from the past. Story 17. The Haunting of the Science Lab. Dr. Elaine Carter was a dedicated science teacher at Ridgeway School, known for her fascination with chemistry and physics. Her science lab was filled with beakers, test tubes, and mysterious apparatuses, but some students found the lab's atmosphere to be unsettling. One evening, a student named Jake decided to stay late to conduct an experiment. As he worked, he noticed that Dr. Carter was still in the lab, engrossed in a series of complex experiments that involved an unusual amount of smoke and bubbling liquids. The lab grew colder as the night progressed, and the flickering fluorescent lights cast eerie shadows on the walls. The equipment began to move on its own, and the air was filled with a faint, unsettling hum. Jake glanced over at Dr. Carter and saw that she was no longer fully visible. Her figure appeared to shimmer and fade, as if she were shifting between reality and some other realm. The smoke from her experiments formed ghostly shapes that drifted through the room. Suddenly, Dr. Carter's voice echoed through the lab, distorted and unnatural. "The experiment must be completed," she said. "The formula must be understood." Jake felt an overwhelming sense of dread and tried to leave, but the doors to the lab were locked, and the windows were covered in a thick, impenetrable fog. The air was filled with the disconcerting sound of bubbling liquids and the distant, ghostly echoes of Dr. Carter's voice. With a surge of panic, Jake managed to force open a window and escape into the night. The next day, the science lab was found in disarray, with broken equipment and spilled chemicals. Dr. Carter was absent, and her whereabouts remained a mystery. The lab became known for its eerie atmosphere, and students avoided it after hours, fearful of the restless spirit of the science teacher. Story 18. The Cursed English Teacher. Mrs. Margaret Green was an English teacher at Elmwood School, known for her love of literature and her strict grading policies. Her classroom was lined with shelves of classic novels and old typewriters. Despite her warm demeanor, there was something unsettling about her teaching methods. One evening, a student named Alex stayed late to work on an essay. As he wrote at his desk, he noticed that Mrs. Green was still in the room, sitting at her desk and typing furiously on an old typewriter. The room was filled with the rhythmic clacking of keys and the rustling of paper. As the night wore on, the classroom grew colder and the lights began to flicker. The air was filled with an eerie stillness, broken only by the constant clacking of the typewriter. Alex glanced over and saw that Mrs. Green's figure seemed to be fading in and out, her movements becoming more erratic. The typewriter's keys began to move on their own, typing out strange and cryptic messages on the paper. The whispers of long-forgotten literary characters filled the air, creating a chilling atmosphere. Shadows on the walls seemed to twist and writhe, taking on distorted shapes. Mrs. Green looked up and said, "The story must be completed. The final chapter is missing." Alex tried to leave, but the door was locked, and the windows were covered in a thick, oppressive darkness. The typewriter's clacking grew louder and more frantic, and the whispers became a dissonant chorus. In a panic, Alex finally managed to force the door open and fled from the classroom. The next day, Mrs. Green was absent, and the classroom was found in disarray, with pages of cryptic text scattered on the floor. The typewriter was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the classroom's unsettling atmosphere remained. Students who heard Alex's story avoided the English classroom after hours, believing it to be cursed by the restless spirit of the teacher and the unfinished story that lingered in the shadows. Story 19. The Ghostly Geography Teacher. Mr. Thomas Reed was a geography teacher at Westfield School, known for his detailed maps and globes. His classroom was filled with topographical models, world maps, and atlases. Despite his enthusiastic teaching, there was something eerie about his passion for the world's mysteries. One evening, a student named Sophie stayed late to work on a geography project. As she worked, she noticed that Mr. Reed was still in the room, examining an ancient, leather-bound atlas with a look of intense concentration. The room felt colder, and the lights flickered intermittently. The maps and globes in the room seemed to shift and change, their features warping into unfamiliar landscapes. The air was filled with an unsettling quiet, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden floor. Sophie glanced over at Mr. Reed and saw that his figure was becoming translucent, as if he were fading into another realm. The maps on the walls began to show distorted and unfamiliar places, and shadows seemed to swirl around the room. Suddenly, Mr. Reed's voice echoed with an otherworldly resonance. "The lost regions must be found," he said. "The maps are incomplete." Sophie tried to leave, but the door was locked tight, and the windows were obscured by an impenetrable fog. The room's atmosphere grew more oppressive, and the shifting maps seemed to pull her into a labyrinth of strange and unsettling geography. With a burst of fear-fueled energy, Sophie managed to force the door open and fled into the night. The next day, Mr. Reed was absent, and the classroom was found in disarray, with maps scattered and the ancient atlas open to a page with cryptic symbols. The room remained a place of dread, haunted by the ghostly geography teacher and the mysteries of the shifting maps. Story 20. The Midnight Art Teacher. Ms. Laura Finch was the art teacher at Crestwood Academy, known for her creativity and unconventional methods. Her art room was filled with canvases, paints, and sculptures. Despite her vibrant personality, there was something unsettling about her art room, especially at night. One evening, a student named Oliver stayed late to finish a painting for an art competition. As he worked, he noticed that Ms. Finch was still in the room, examining an array of strange, abstract paintings that covered the walls. The room grew colder, and a thick fog began to settle around the edges of the room. The paintings on the walls seemed to come to life, their colors shifting and swirling in disturbing patterns. The fog began to form ghostly shapes that seemed to move and shift. Oliver glanced over at Ms. Finch and saw that her figure appeared blurred and distorted, as if she were fading in and out of reality. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Oliver could hear soft, eerie whispers coming from the paintings, as if the images were trying to communicate with him. The temperature dropped further, and he felt an inexplicable chill. Ms. Finch's voice echoed through the darkness, distorted and haunting. "The art must be completed," she said. "The canvas is incomplete." Terrified, Oliver tried to leave, but the door was locked tight, and the fog made it difficult to see. The paintings seemed to move closer, their ghostly forms reaching out toward him. The whispers grew louder, creating a cacophony of unsettling sounds. With a burst of panic, Oliver managed to force open a window and escape into the night. The next day, Ms. Finch was absent, and the art room was found in disarray, with paint splattered across the floor and the paintings covered in a thick layer of dust. The eerie atmosphere remained, and students avoided the art room after hours, fearful of the restless spirits and the haunting art that seemed to come to life. Story 21. The Enchanted Literature Teacher. Mr. Andrew Blackwood was a literature teacher at Riverview School, renowned for his dramatic readings and deep love for classic novels. His classroom was lined with shelves of old, leather-bound books and ornate reading chairs. However, some students found the room's atmosphere to be oddly unsettling. One evening, a student named Claire stayed late to read a novel for her literature class. As she sat in a corner of the room, she noticed that Mr. Blackwood was still there, engrossed in a large, ancient book with elaborate illustrations. The room grew dim, and the shadows seemed to dance along the walls. Claire glanced over and saw that Mr. Blackwood's figure was flickering and shifting, his face illuminated by the eerie glow of the book. The illustrations in the book seemed to move and change, their scenes coming to life in an unsettling manner. The air grew colder, and Claire could hear soft, haunting whispers coming from the book. The shadows on the walls began to twist into strange, surreal shapes, and the temperature dropped significantly. The room was filled with a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to emanate from the book itself. Mr. Blackwood looked up with a distant, eerie smile. "The story must be told," he said. "The pages hold the truth." Claire tried to leave, but the door was stuck, and the windows were covered in an impenetrable fog. The whispers grew louder, and the illustrations in the book seemed to reach out toward her, pulling her into their surreal world. In a fit of terror, Claire managed to force the door open and fled into the night. The next day, Mr. Blackwood was absent, and his classroom was found in disarray, with books scattered and the ancient tome lying open with its cryptic illustrations visible. The room remained a place of dread, haunted by the ghostly teacher and the enchanted book that seemed to hold dark secrets. Story 22. The Phantom Chemistry Professor. Dr. Helen Carter was a chemistry professor at Blackstone University, known for her groundbreaking research and meticulous experiments. Her laboratory was filled with state-of-the-art equipment and mysterious compounds. Despite her reputation, there were unsettling rumors about her lab. One evening, a student named Daniel stayed late to work on an advanced chemistry project. As he worked, he noticed that Dr. Carter was still in the lab, engrossed in an experiment involving an ancient-looking vial. The lab grew colder, and the lights flickered intermittently. The equipment in the lab began to move on its own, and strange, eerie noises filled the air. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift and morph into unsettling shapes. Daniel glanced over and saw that Dr. Carter's figure was becoming increasingly transparent, her face pale and expressionless. The air was filled with a faint, otherworldly hum, and the vial's contents began to glow with an unsettling light. The temperature dropped sharply, and Daniel felt an intense chill. The lab seemed to close in on him, and the whispers of long-forgotten chemical formulas filled the air. Dr. Carter's voice echoed through the lab, distorted and haunting. "The formula must be completed," she said. "The experiment is not finished." Daniel tried to leave, but the door was locked tight, and the windows were covered in a thick fog. The lab's atmosphere grew more oppressive, and the glowing vial seemed to cast eerie, shifting shadows across the room. In a panic, Daniel managed to force open a window and escape into the night. The next day, Dr. Carter was absent, and the lab was found in disarray, with equipment scattered and the vial's glowing contents gone. The lab remained a place of dread, haunted by the spectral professor and the unfinished experiment that seemed to linger in the shadows. Story 23. The Enigmatic Music Instructor. Mr. Jonathan Hayes was the music instructor at Willow Creek School, known for his passion for classical music and his elaborate compositions. His music room was filled with grand pianos, sheet music, and old musical instruments. Despite his talent, there was something disquieting about his presence after dark. One evening, a student named Rachel stayed late to practice a challenging piece on the piano. As she played, she noticed that Mr. Hayes was still in the room, conducting an invisible orchestra with an intense, almost frantic energy. The room grew colder, and the lights began to flicker. Rachel glanced over and saw that Mr. Hayes's figure appeared ethereal and shimmering, his movements both graceful and disjointed. The sheet music on the stands began to rustle and change, displaying eerie, unfamiliar notes and symbols. The temperature in the room dropped, and the sound of distant, ghostly music filled the air. The shadows on the walls seemed to move in sync with the music, creating an unsettling visual display. The air was thick with a sense of impending dread. Mr. Hayes turned to Rachel with a haunting smile. "The symphony must be completed," he said in a voice that seemed to echo from another world. "The final movement is missing." Terrified, Rachel tried to leave, but the door was locked, and the windows were obscured by a thick, oppressive darkness. The ghostly music grew louder and more chaotic, and the shadows on the walls twisted into nightmarish shapes. In a fit of fear, Rachel managed to force open a window and fled into the night. The next day, Mr. Hayes was absent, and the music room was found in disarray, with sheet music scattered and the grand piano covered in a thick layer of dust. The room's unsettling atmosphere remained, and students avoided it after hours, fearing the spectral presence of the music instructor and the unfinished symphony that lingered in the shadows. Story 24. The Bewitched Biology Teacher. Ms. Linda Thompson was the biology teacher at Meadowbrook High, known for her intense enthusiasm for the natural world. Her classroom was filled with specimens, microscopes, and jars of preserved animals. Despite her apparent passion, students felt an unsettling chill in her lab. One evening, a student named James stayed late to work on a project about cellular biology. As he worked, he noticed Ms. Thompson was still in the lab, examining a large, ancient-looking biology book with disturbing illustrations of grotesque creatures and bizarre anatomy. The room grew unnaturally cold, and the lights flickered erratically. James glanced up and saw that Miss Thompson's figure seemed to shimmer and distort, her eyes glowing with an eerie light. The specimens in the jars began to move slightly, as if stirred by an unseen force. The shadows on the walls seemed to come alive, forming unsettling shapes and figures. The temperature in the room dropped further, and James felt an oppressive weight pressing down on him. The book Miss Thompson was holding began to emit a faint, eerie glow, and the air was filled with the soft whispers of strange, otherworldly voices. Ms. Thompson looked up with a disturbing smile. "The experiment must be completed," she said in a voice that sounded both hollow and resonant. "The specimens are restless." Terrified, James tried to leave, but the door was locked tight, and the windows were covered in a dense fog. The shadows grew darker and more menacing, and the specimens in the jars seemed to writhe and shift. In a panic, James managed to force open a window and fled into the night. The next day, Ms. Thompson was absent, and the biology lab was found in disarray, with specimens scattered and the ancient book lying open to a page depicting grotesque, unfamiliar creatures. The unsettling atmosphere lingered, and students avoided the lab after hours, fearful of the restless spirits and the haunted biology teacher. Story 25. The Sinister History Professor. Professor Edward Grant was a history teacher at Crestfield College, known for his extensive knowledge of ancient civilizations and his eerie fascination with historical artifacts. His office was filled with relics, dusty tomes, and strange curiosities from different eras. Despite his scholarly reputation, students found his office unnervingly dark and oppressive. One evening, a student named Amelia stayed late to research a paper on ancient Egypt. As she worked, she noticed Professor Grant was still in his office, hunched over an old leather-bound journal with cryptic symbols and disturbing illustrations. The room grew colder and the lights dimmed to a low, flickering glow. Amelia glanced over and saw that Professor Grant's figure appeared ghostly and translucent, his face gaunt and expressionless. The artifacts in the office began to shift and move on their own, and the shadows on the walls seemed to twist into unsettling shapes. The temperature dropped significantly, and the air was filled with a soft, eerie chanting in an ancient, unknown language. The journal's pages began to turn by themselves, revealing disturbing prophecies and ominous predictions. Professor Grant looked up with a chilling, vacant stare. "The past must be revealed," he said in a voice that echoed with an unsettling resonance. "The ancient curse is awakening." Desperate to leave, Amelia found that the door was locked tight and the windows were obscured by a dense, dark fog. The shadows on the walls grew darker and more threatening, and the eerie chanting grew louder. In a surge of fear, Amelia managed to force open a window and escaped into the night. The next day, Professor Grant was absent, and his office was found in disarray, with artifacts scattered and the ancient journal open to a page filled with cryptic symbols. The office remained a place of dread, haunted by the spectral professor and the ominous curse that seemed to linger in the shadows. Story 26. The Cursed Drama Teacher. Ms. Evelyn Brooks was the drama teacher at Willow Heights School, known for her dramatic productions and her intense passion for theater. Her classroom was filled with costumes, props, and stage sets. Despite her flair for the dramatic, there was something unsettling about her classroom after hours. One evening, a student named Lucas stayed late to work on a script for an upcoming play. As he worked, he noticed that Ms. Brooks was still in the room, rehearsing a monologue in front of an old, ornate mirror. The room grew colder and the lights flickered ominously. Lucas glanced over and saw that Ms. Brooks's reflection in the mirror appeared distorted and unsettling, her movements jerky and unnatural. The costumes and props seemed to come alive, shifting and rearranging themselves in eerie ways. The shadows on the walls danced in unsettling patterns. The temperature dropped further, and Lucas felt an oppressive sense of dread. The mirror began to glow with a strange, otherworldly light, and the whispers of long-forgotten theater scripts filled the air. Ms. Brooks turned to Lucas with a hauntingly vacant expression. "The performance must go on," she said in a voice that seemed to come from another world. "The play is never complete." Frightened, Lucas tried to leave, but the door was locked tight, and the windows were obscured by an impenetrable fog. The shadows grew darker and more menacing, and the mirror's lights seemed to draw him in. In a burst of panic, Lucas managed to force open a window and fled into the night. The next day, Ms. Brooks was absent, and the classroom was found in disarray, with costumes scattered and the mirror covered in a thick layer of dust. The unsettling atmosphere remained, and students avoided the drama room after hours, fearful of the haunted mirror and the cursed performance that seemed to linger in the shadows. Story 27. The Eerie Physical Education Instructor. Coach Derek Mason was the physical education instructor at Elmcrest School, known for his rigorous training sessions and competitive spirit. The gymnasium was his domain, filled with equipment, trophies, and banners. Despite his energetic demeanor, there was an eerie sense of foreboding in the gym after dark. One evening, a student named Natalie stayed late to practice for an upcoming sports event. As she worked, she noticed that Coach Mason was still in the gym, pacing the floor with an intense focus. The room grew colder, and the lights began to flicker erratically. Natalie glanced over and saw that Coach Mason's figure appeared distorted and shadowy, his movements jerky and unnatural. The gym equipment began to move on its own, and the shadows on the walls took on unsettling, monstrous shapes. The temperature dropped sharply, and Natalie felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The gym's banners and trophies seemed to sway and shift, creating an oppressive atmosphere. The air was filled with distant, ghostly cheers and the sound of phantom footsteps. Coach Mason turned to Natalie with a haunting glare. "The game must be won," he said in a voice that seemed to echo with an unsettling intensity. "The competition is eternal." Terrified, Natalie tried to leave, but the door was locked tight and the windows were obscured by a dense fog. The shadows grew darker and more threatening, and the ghostly cheers became a deafening cacophony. In a desperate effort, Natalie managed to force open a window and escaped into the night. The next day, Coach Mason was absent, and the gym was found in disarray, with equipment scattered and the banners hanging crookedly. The eerie atmosphere lingered, and students avoided the gym after hours, fearing the restless spirit of the coach and the eternal competition that seemed to haunt the space. Story 28. The Ghostly Algebra Teacher. Mr. Charles Dawson was the algebra teacher at Greenfield High, known for his precise teaching and complex equations. His classroom was filled with chalkboards covered in mathematical formulas and diagrams. Despite his methodical approach, there was something unsettling about the room after dark. One evening, a student named Megan stayed late to finish a challenging algebra assignment. As she worked, she noticed that Mr. Dawson was still in the room, scribbling equations on the board with an ancient-looking piece of chalk. The room grew colder, and the lights flickered ominously. Megan glanced up and saw that Mr. Dawson's figure appeared increasingly translucent, his face hollow and expressionless. The equations on the chalkboard seemed to shift and change, forming disturbing patterns and symbols. The shadows on the walls seemed to writhe and twist, casting eerie shapes. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and Megan felt a sense of foreboding. The chalkboard's equations began to glow with an unnatural light, and the air was filled with the faint, unsettling hum of mathematical formulas. Mr. Dawson turned to Megan with a chilling, vacant stare. "The solution must be found," he said in a voice that echoed eerily. "The equation is incomplete." Frightened, Megan tried to leave, but the door was locked, and the windows were obscured by a thick fog. The shadows grew darker and more menacing, and the glowing equations seemed to pull her into their unsettling world. In a panic, Megan managed to force open a window and fled into the night. The next day, Mr. Dawson was absent and the classroom was found in disarray, with equations scrawled across the board in a chaotic manner. The unsettling atmosphere lingered, and students avoided the room after hours, fearing the restless spirit of the algebra teacher and the haunting equations. Story 29. The Cursed Art Teacher. Miss Clara Lewis was the art teacher at Fairview School, known for her unique and avant-garde approach to painting and sculpture. Her art room was filled with colorful paintings, sculptures, and art supplies. Despite her vibrant personality, there was something unnerving about the room when the lights went out. One evening, a student named Ben stayed late to work on a sculpture for an art project. As he worked, he noticed that Ms. Lewis was still in the room, carefully examining a collection of old, eerie paintings. The room grew colder and the lights flickered intermittently. Ben glanced over and saw that Ms. Lewis's figure appeared ghostly and blurred, her movements both graceful and unsettling. The paintings on the walls seemed to come to life, their colors shifting and swirling in disturbing ways. The shadows on the walls grew longer and more menacing. The temperature dropped significantly, and Ben felt an oppressive sense of dread. The paintings seemed to reach out toward him, their eyes following his every move. The air was filled with whispers of artistic critiques and unsettling voices. Ms. Lewis turned to Ben with a haunting smile. "The masterpiece must be finished," she said in a voice that sounded both ancient and hollow. "The art is never complete." Desperate to leave, Ben found that the door was locked tight and the windows were covered in a dense, dark fog. The paintings grew more disturbing, and the whispers became a deafening chorus. In a frantic effort, Ben managed to force open a window and escaped into the night. The next day, Ms. Lewis was absent, and the art room was found in disarray, with paintings scattered and the sculpture unfinished. The eerie atmosphere remained, and students avoided the room after hours, fearing the haunted art and the restless spirit of the teacher. Story 30. The Phantom Guidance Counselor. Mr. Harold Wells was the guidance counselor at Crestwood Academy, known for his meticulous advice and stern demeanor. His office was filled with academic records, motivational posters, and old counseling books. Despite his professional appearance, there was an unsettling air about his office after dark. One evening, a student named Lily stayed late to discuss college applications. As she waited in the office, she noticed that Mr. Wells was still there, shuffling through a large stack of old, dusty files. The room grew colder and the lights began to flicker. Lily glanced over and saw that Mr. Wells's figure appeared faint and translucent, his movements slow and disjointed. The files on the desk began to move on their own, and the shadows on the walls grew longer and more ominous. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and Lily felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The motivational posters seemed to distort and shift, their messages becoming eerie and unsettling. The air was filled with the faint sound of whispers and distant, ghostly conversations. Mr. Wells turned to Lily with a chilling gaze. "The future must be decided," he said in a voice that echoed with an otherworldly resonance. "The path is uncertain." Frightened, Lily tried to leave, but the door was locked tight and the windows were covered in a thick, oppressive fog. The shadows grew darker and more menacing, and the whispers became a haunting cacophony. In a desperate effort, Lily managed to force open a window and fled into the night. The next day, Mr. Wells was absent, and his office was found in disarray, with files scattered and the motivational posters hanging crookedly. The unsettling atmosphere lingered, and students avoided the office after hours, fearing the restless spirit of the guidance counselor and the uncertain future he represented. Story 31. The Eerie Physics Teacher. Dr. Samuel Reed was the physics teacher at Highgate School, known for his enthusiasm for experimental physics and complex theories. His classroom was filled with scientific equipment, diagrams, and old physics texts. Despite his knowledge, there was something unnerving about his lab at night. One evening, a student named Ethan stayed late to work on a physics experiment. As he worked, he noticed that Dr. Reed was still in the room, intently focused on a series of strange, glowing apparatuses. The room grew colder, and the lights flickered erratically. Ethan glanced up and saw that Dr. Reed's figure appeared ghostly and distorted, his face pale and expressionless. The scientific equipment began to move on its own, and the shadows on the walls seemed to shift and twist. The temperature dropped significantly, and Ethan felt an oppressive sense of dread. The diagrams on the walls began to warp and change, and the air was filled with a low, eerie hum of experimental machinery. Dr. Reed turned to Ethan with a haunting gaze. "The experiment must be completed," he said in a voice that sounded both ancient and hollow. "The theory is incomplete." Desperate to escape, Ethan found that the door was locked tight and the windows were covered in a thick, impenetrable fog. The shadows grew darker and more threatening, and the eerie hum became a deafening roar. In a panic, Ethan managed to force open a window and fled into the night. The next day, Dr. Reed was absent, and the lab was found in disarray, with equipment scattered and the glowing apparatuses dark and cold. The unsettling atmosphere remained, and students avoided the lab after hours, fearing the restless spirit of the physics teacher and the incomplete experiment that haunted the space. Story 32. The Haunting Geography Teacher. Mr. Arnold Blake was the geography teacher at Hillside Academy, known for his extensive knowledge of world maps and his passion for exploration. His classroom was adorned with globes, maps, and travel memorabilia. Despite his friendly demeanor, there was an unsettling aura in the room after dark. One evening, a student named Rachel stayed late to work on a project about ancient civilizations. As she worked, she noticed that Mr. Blake was still in the classroom, studying an old, tattered world map pinned to the wall. The room grew colder and the lights flickered ominously. Rachel glanced over and saw that Mr. Blake's figure appeared shadowy and indistinct, his movements slow and eerie. The maps on the walls began to shift and change, with countries and continents warping into unfamiliar shapes. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and contract, creating unsettling patterns. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and Rachel felt a sense of foreboding. The world map began to glow with an otherworldly light, and the air was filled with whispers of lost civilizations and distant lands. Mr. Blake turned to Rachel with a haunting smile. "The journey must continue," he said in a voice that echoed with an unsettling resonance. "The map is incomplete." Frightened, Rachel tried to leave, but the door was locked tight, and the windows were obscured by a dense fog. The shadows grew darker and more menacing, and the glowing map seemed to pull her into its unsettling world. In a panic, Rachel managed to force open a window and fled into the night. The next day, Mr. Blake was absent, and the classroom was found in disarray, with maps scattered and the old world map lying on the floor. The eerie atmosphere remained, and students avoided the room after hours, fearing the restless spirit of the geography teacher and the haunted map. Story 33. The Enigmatic Music Teacher. Ms. Amelia Foster was the music teacher at Westfield High, known for her love of classical music and her impressive collection of antique instruments. Her music room was filled with grand pianos, violins, and old music sheets. Despite her warm demeanor, there was something disquieting about the room after dark. One evening, a student named Adam stayed late to practice a challenging piece on the piano. As he played, he noticed that Ms. Foster was still in the room, tuning an old, dusty violin. The room grew colder, and the lights flickered ominously. Adam glanced up and saw that Ms. Foster's figure appeared ethereal and distorted, her movements graceful yet unsettling. The instruments in the room began to move on their own, and the shadows on the walls seemed to dance in sync with the eerie music. The temperature dropped significantly, and Adam felt an oppressive sense of dread. The music sheets began to flutter and change, revealing strange, haunting melodies. The air was filled with ghostly strains of music and distant, mournful notes. Ms. Foster turned to Adam with a haunting gaze. "The concert must go on," she said in a voice that seemed to come from another world. "The performance is incomplete." Desperate to leave, Adam found that the door was locked tight and the windows were covered in a thick, dark fog. The shadows grew darker and more menacing, and the ghostly music became a chilling symphony. In a fit of panic, Adam managed to force open a window and fled into the night. The next day, Ms. Foster was absent, and the music room was found in disarray, with instruments scattered and the music sheets in disarray. The unsettling atmosphere lingered, and students avoided the room after hours, fearing the haunted instruments and the restless spirit of the music teacher.